Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the third day of Art Basel conversations presented or co-presented with Qatar Creates Talks. It's great to see you in such large numbers, and without much further ado, I would like to introduce our panel. The topic is Art in the Open, Rethinking What a Public Can Be. It gives me an immense pleasure to introduce Sumayya Vally, architect, Johannesburg, Rayyane Tabet, artist from Beirut, and Shezad Dawood, artist, London. Our moderator for today is Sheikha Reem Thani, who is the Deputy CEO for Riwaq, Public Art, and Rubaiya, Qatar, and my dear colleague at Qatar Museums. So welcome to our panelists, and Reem, take it away.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yelena, and welcome. Well, good evening. They said to say good evening, but it's actually afternoon. So welcome to Art in the Open, Rethinking what a public can be. Public art has often been understood through monuments, plazas, and impermanence. Yet today's artists are expanding the public, the meaning of what public is. It's not a fixed audience, it's not a fixed space, but something that is formed through encounters, participation, translation, and shared experiences. This conversation is especially important and urgent in the context of the region and the global south. Spaces where public spaces carry layered of historical, political, social, and environmental meanings, and where art can offer new ways of gathering, remembering, and imagining communities beyond boundaries. Rather than treating the public art as an object placed in space, this panel asks how art might create space itself. Space of connections, ownership, maintenance, and dialogue. And I wanted to bring the guests here specifically after having a very interesting conversation from each of their views. And I'm delighted to be joined by the three of them. Sumayya Vally is the founder and a principal of Counterspace, an architectural practice based in Johannesburg. Her work is deeply rooted in questioning of memory, identity, and spatial justice, often engaging with communities and histories. Her work can be seen in the Baraha, actually, outside with Art Basel. We have Rayyane Tabet, also an artist based in Beirut, who practices bridges sculpture, archaeology, and archival research. He often reveals his histories, how histories, particularly through shaped colonization, extraction, and displacement, and you can see his artwork in the Radwani house, which is a temporary piece that he's created for us. And Shezad Dawood, a London-based artist, multidisciplinary practice, spans across films, installations, painting, and collaborative projects. His work is frequently engaged with global histories. We're actually working, people can see his artworks in Al Masrah Park, really redefining or bringing back modernist architecture, and we're working closely with him on different projects. Together, we'll explore how public operates in translation and transmission, which is Sumayya's tidbit, and how it engages communities, environments, and shared encounters. To open up a more broad conversation, any of you can answer this. When we speak about the public today, particularly in our regional context, who is included and who might still remain unseen? Does the public exist before the artwork, or does it come into being through the public or that encounters? So if any of you would like to start? No? Okay, Sumayya.
Thank you so much. It's so wonderful to be here in such incredible and esteemed company. I think this, for me, is really one of the highlights of the week. I also want to say thank you so much to Elif, who's sitting here, for managing all of the special projects. It was really an honor to be a part of this historic event and edition. Maybe to start with the second point about if a public exists or whether it emerges. I think that for me, perhaps it is always both. And I remember when I first started to work in London, which was my first project outside of Johannesburg, somebody asked me how my audience had shifted, because for the longest time, and perhaps even now, I speak very passionately about being able to find design form and creative expression for our places, our contexts, our cultures that come from canons that we are making. And I used to speak about it exclusively in Johannesburg, but of course now I find it to be relevant everywhere that I am. But I think on the question of audience, I said then, and I think this is still true now, that my audience necessarily hasn't shifted. I think I still find, but perhaps more so when I was a young practitioner, that what I was trying to say was often inarticulate in the profession or inarticulable to the broader profession. And I felt like I was shouting into a void or screaming into a vacuum. But I think that it is important to have the space to be able to work and create and to experiment, to think from these positions of difference. And our audience should always be somehow our ancestors and our children. Having said that, I do think that the audience does exist, and I think that we're also included in that audience. I'm often frustrated when I'm in consulting roles or working kind of on the inside of shaping institutional conversations, that we really, and this happens all the time in architecture schools, we separate ourselves from the public. We talk about the public, but we are also the public. And I think now more so than ever, in our context, in our geographies, especially here, we are in a position to say, and we have the responsibility to be asking questions of how we want to shape our spaces and how we want to see ourselves in those spaces. And maybe just to conclude this thought, when I was working with Lina Lazar and the Kamal Lazar Foundation on Ibraz, and I mentioned this to some colleagues in passing yesterday, when Shuman Basar invited me to work on the project, I was reminded that a few years ago he asked me if I could see myself spending more time in London. And at that time I said that, my life in Johannesburg and the spaces that we inhabit are so discursive, I didn't quite see that happening in London yet. But through working on this project, I've really seen so many different facets of spaces and communities and audiences come together, both in the building and the making of the project and also in what it hosts in that space. And for me, that's been a lesson that when we foreground formats that are resonant with our communities and with where we come from and things that we deeply believe in, people will come.
Thank you. Shezad, do you want to add to that?
Well, just to follow on from, I think, what you've both said, I think, for the longest time, maybe 20 years or more, I've always very much believed in an ethics of practice, an ethics of process, and an ethics of place. And that sounds vague, so I will try and unpack it a bit. It's also very simple. It's that the audience exists before you, with you, through you, and after you. And it's never separate. I love your point about we are also the public. And it's breaking down some of those fourth walls. I mean, one of the interesting things, I was just doing an interview the other day, and the interviewer was shocked because I said, I nearly didn't go into visual art, I nearly went into set design. And for me, it's an idea of thresholds. This idea of taking a public with you needs to equally be balanced by letting a public take you where you didn't know you were going. So for example, to bring it into a coherent example, here in Doha with the modern playground that I did a few years ago, which Sheikha Reem said you can go and visit in Al Masra Park off the Corniche, it was a 2-year research project. One of the joys for me was the dialogue with Fatma Al-Salawi, a local architect, architectural historian, but also with the endless communities. And why did it take 2 years? Because it felt like we went in search of an archive that came through people. We found people who, from multiple generations, who had been here before these architectural histories were even enacted, had been there at the unveiling of the Gulf cinema, who could share, and I'm getting goosebumps now because people told me about the opening. And it's this amazing thing because I felt transported to the opening of the Gulf cinema and what it meant for the region, for the city, for the country. And then that's where the ethics comes in, because once people are sharing their collected social memories with you, your responsibility grows. How do you reciprocate acts of generosity? Through embodying, making, and it's always collective, because one of the things that's been amazing and why, for me, an ethics is also just to take time. It's that simple. You spend the time. And it shows when you do and when you don't.
Definitely. Well, working in an interesting research that will be published soon with Shezad. And Ryan, since you didn't get to speak on the first one, I'll direct my first question to you. When we had our conversation, you spoke about artwork, and artwork is completed only when it's encountered. How does this idea shift our understanding of authorship in public space? And when histories are fragmented, displaced, or partially invisible, can absence itself become a shared public experience?
I mean, in the types of practices that I'm interested in, which are, conceptual sculpture ultimately, the idea of the work is incomplete, right? Until it is not only encountered, but also reacted to, right? So in a way, I always say that the artwork is an excuse for a conversation. And until you have the conversation, the artwork doesn't exist. So when we think about that proposition within the context of public space, it is the public art becomes almost its function or its potentials are really spaces for conversations. And that, in my opinion, is a radically different logic of encounter when we think about it within the gallery or the museum space. Not that that is also impossible there, but our duties, responsibilities, and also reactiveness, the parameters are very different. And especially when, in the case of the research that I'm interested in, kind of uncovering hidden histories or looking for traces you're actually starting from an act of erasure almost always. And that, it starts by actually bringing voices before you bring objects and material. So it's like the act of making becomes an act of conjuring, right? Like how can we first listen to these voices that were there through the materials, through the objects, through whatever is left behind, and slowly build something from within rather than imposing something on top of a site. And that kind of, I think, establishes a very different type of making, right? Even though the processes ultimately end up being kind of an imposition, right? I mean, in a formal condition, the proposal is actually exactly the contrary. So, which means that not only is the work completed through the act of encounter, the work needs to be open to various forms of encounter and interpretation and audiences. So it's kind of a cumulative process, because the very act of making the work is an act of almost like excavation, kind of finding all these layers and seeing how these layers could then in a moment take shape. And I mean that, to build up on both Sumayya and Shezad's point, then it becomes about not only being the audience we imagine, but also recentering the conversation towards almost acts of resistance, right? Because it's kind of a quiet insistence that our presence matters and that these moments of encounter kind of lift that by giving it shape, if that makes sense.
Thank you. Another question popped into my head, but I'll keep it for later. So I'll go back to Shezad. Many of your projects unfold collaboratively and across geographical regions, materials and cultural references, including your engagement with materials like onyx in Qatar, which is, I'm announcing it to a certain extent. How do you approach translation across contexts, and what allows your work to resonate locally while still speaking beyond borders?
Okay, big question. You know, I remember when I was still studying, and one of my tutors was part of an artist duo, and they'd done a piece of public art, and the local community burnt it down. And that was a lesson very early on in, okay, how do you avoid the local community burning your work down? I think you've got to take people with you. So for me, it was like the research is always collaborative and the community. And in some ways, it's funny because earlier in my career, it was very much about, a sort of post-colonial logics, thinking of nature and time, maybe from a non-Western center. And then over time, I've relaxed. So for example, I did a project in Italy last year. I won this prize from UNESCO and the Veneto region to explore the biodiversity of the hills above Venice. And there's a little image somewhere in the carousel of this crazy gizmo that's attached to a tree. And I took a friend of mine who's a professor of ethnobotany with me on this journey through the hills, and he has this apparatus that can allow you to listen and record the sound frequencies that mycelium, roots, fungi are speaking the whole time. And as a result, all the local farmers who didn't understand or care about contemporary art, but they wanted to hear the trees. And it was interesting because at the big presentation, we had all the VIPs from UNESCO, the government, etc. But they were shocked. There were all these farmers. And, always I think, taking that level of responsibility for the communities you work with, it's very stressful. But after the opening, the VIPs wanted to shake my hand, but they had literally 200 farmers came and were embracing me before the VIPs could shake my hand. And I was like, okay. I just wanted to answer your question through an example, but I think it's about a commitment to the people in the place you're working, wherever it is. You suspend your prior knowledge, your preconceptions, and you enter a space open, with an open mind, with an open heart, and you find something together.
It's very interesting. Don't we need to put this in one of our criteria, artwork that does not require being burned down by the public? But Sumayya, I wanted to also, interesting to have this, working with an audience and going back to nature to a certain extent. Your work is deeply rooted in research, memory, engagement, and specific communities. How do you think that translation and transmission, when working with historians, that must move from lived experiences into the public sphere? And how do you navigate the tension between design for a public and designing with a public? Good questions.
Thank you. I think, again, designing for or with the public, we also are the public, I'm going to say again. But on the question of translation, I think that all of us are people who are constantly translating from one context or one condition to the other without realizing it. For me, I think it's completely subconscious, and I think there is a sense of belonging that is felt. For example, here, because this is one facet because I am Muslim, because I'm of the global south. So there is a shared resonance across context. And so it feels very familiar in that regard. And somehow I think perhaps in many places that I find myself, I also feel those resonances. And so I don't know where my center is, or if I have a center, or where the periphery is, and if I am on the periphery even. I think instead of thinking about nodes, I'm thinking always about the lines that connect those. And earlier in the week, I mentioned a project, for example, in Belgium that we saw on the slides, where the concept was inspired by somebody from the Congo who was from that town and was never really recognized. He has been largely erased from history. And when we found that he came from this town, Vilvoorde, his name is Paul Panda Fanana, we decided that our project should be an homage to him. And that was really about the resonances across history and across place. And I think that no matter what I think I'm doing on a project, and often when I'm working on something, I think, okay, it's not about that thing. This is about the sky from an Islamic perspective or something. It still becomes about the connections that we have across places. My project at the Serpentine in London, which we also saw a little bit earlier, was about London's migrant communities and places that first became home or became strongholds for cultural production and a sense of belonging for people when they first moved to the city. And Islamic Arts Biennale that we saw slides of earlier as well in Jeddah. For that project, the theme for the first Biennale was Awwal Bayt, or first house, which is a term of reverence that's given to the Kaaba in Mecca. And we were really thinking about how our rituals surround the Kaaba and how we ground and orientate ourselves in relation to it. It's a point of connection for the Ummah. Every time we stand up in prayer and face towards the Kaaba, we are connected and joined with, again, our audiences, people past, present, and future who will stand up and do the same. And so we're connecting to this very old and also very future energy when we do that. But Awwal Bayt also refers to this idea of home. And we were really thinking about how we construct home and construct belonging through our rituals, through our daily prayers, and through what is prescribed to us in the faith, but also our communal rituals, how we come together for festivities, how we grieve and mourn together, how we celebrate together, what are the first principles of belonging after movement and after migration, and how those rituals allow us to construct our environments and recenter ourselves, no matter where we find ourselves in the world. This is a question I think that so many Muslim communities are reckoning with right now, always, but especially so right now, with so much displacement that we see in our geographies. And I think that is certainly something to always be thinking about and to reckon with. But in those same intelligences, there is the resilience in how people find ways to come together to make home despite so much. But there is also deep intelligence for creating new forms of institution, for reshaping the way that platforms like biennales, like art fairs, like museums, are made, what they can offer, who are they for, how do they work, what are they propelling forward, what bodies of knowledge are they building for the future. And it's not for me about being able to take a work and put it in a pre-existing context. It's really that the work also needs to trouble the fringes. I don't want to use words like agitate, but perhaps without saying, I am not this, I am not this, I am not this, just by making a proposition for who we are, what we are, where we come from, and what we imagine, we can offer different worlds that provide different formats.
Thank you. I often find that now, as we work from an institution point, working with a lot of artists and commissioning a lot of artists, I see a lot of, with us not trusting the media anymore, that artists become the historians. They are the ones who are translating what the historians are writing. Again, a new form of informing the world has come up, and I think we're in a, if we are looking at a history book, this moment in time will actually reflect a lot of these elements of how artists have been translating what research is being given out, what new narratives are being created, and more with the audience, with the public sphere specifically. But it is very powerful to be able to do that as an artist, to document, to create history, to create a dialogue and conversation. So to jump a little bit into the second portion of this, which is encounter, environment, and ownership. Public works don't exist in isolation in any way. They meet the wind, sun, water, and daily life as we regulate in regulation with our, as regulation and policy. Politics, how do the environment and social encounters reshape the meaning of artwork as it's installed? So this is a question maybe for Ryan. Yeah.
I think maybe one of the misconceptions of public art is this idea of permanence, that we're supposed to be making these things that are forever. And from the get-go, if one lets go of that, it opens up a field that is so much bigger. Specifically when, of course, we have to respond to environmental conditions, to also certain social, economic, political, material conditions. But the moment we start expanding our view of what those can be, I think is the moment where public art moves from kind of this obsession with monumentality and permanence to a real proposition as to how can we embrace erasure? How can we embrace impermanence? How can we embrace radical shifts within societies that happen everywhere all the time? And I think it's maybe trying to imagine or rethink what we want longevity to be, right? So a lot of times we think that certain materials are used in public artworks because they last. But if we were to really listen to the materials, they're precisely their ephemeral quality that makes them more interesting. Not because they kind of embrace the impermanence of our time in this space on this earth for now, but also they maybe open up a different way of making work. And so I really like what you were saying, Sheikh Reem, this kind of duty and responsibility towards artists to kind of also enter history. Think about how do we become kind of leaving traces, right? So I really think that our duty and responsibility right now, especially in public art, is to kind of create a gesture that leaves a mark that can be read later as a trace and interpreted. And in order to do that, really confronting the very contradictory nature of what it is we're invited to do, right? So I think, when I was originally trained as an architect, there's this almost understanding that almost everything that you'll do will outlive you. And it's a tough realization to have, right? But the moment you kind of embrace that, what other worlds and possibilities open? At the same time, we live in a world where we're seeing things destroyed around us all the time. So how could we also embrace that reality, right? The precarity of seeing the world around us for a variety of reasons crumbling. So when we're invited, each of us, to think of permanence, it's not only a material condition. How can I dig deeper foundation? What kind of bronze do I need to cast this in? What you know, what is the stone that will last for 100 years? It's actually thinking, what can we propose in a world that is constantly shifting, constantly reinventing itself, and in a way, constantly in ruins?
Thank you. When we were having our discussion online before, there were two works that I brought into the conversation that you know, they weren't permanent or never actually meant to be permanent. One of them was right with the blockade on Qatar and everything. We had a Martin Creed that was displayed on the corniche that said everything is going to be all right. And you know, it's made of neon, so the lights sometimes would go off, and as soon as that would happen, people would call us, be like, the letter G is off, like things like that. The public in general, it wasn't just people working in the organization. And then when we removed it, because again, it wasn't a public artwork, we knew that we needed to install it somewhere where it will be public. It's now installed at the Sheraton, where, you know, the Doha Forum, other big events happen here. The other work was the inflatable by Jeff Koons, which he made a dugong, which is the animal we celebrate here in Qatar. And it was on the corniche, and it was supposed to last for 6 months. We made it last for a year, and people would every day on their commute. So as we were deinstalling, you know, it started deflating, it's changing, and people would be like, something is wrong, or post about it, like as if something is really wrong with the artwork. And like, we kept it for a full year because people liked it. But this idea of actually having things that engage with the public, and you think they don't get it, or it's not part of their daily life, but it is. So I have another question, maybe Shezad and Sumayya can answer. We've discussed examples where communities feel genuine ownership over work, caring for them, maintaining them, or integrating into their daily rituals. What distinguishes true collective belonging from a symbolic or performative practice or participation?
Oh, well, in some ways I feel I spoke to that a bit earlier, so maybe I'll try and build on that. And I think, you know, there's also something, you know, I've spent a lot of time figuring out recently, which is, you know, a lot of my deep connection to ideas of cycles of time, nature, memory, come from my childhood in Karachi. So it is from a sort of Islamic cosmology, but to the world. And I think it's this way of thinking through being and being present to others, and then being present to you. So it's actually inviting people into a project so they become part of it. And it's thinking about it. I think I touched on this idea of nearly going into set design, but for me it's, and I used to think this was maybe coming from an Islamic culture, but I think it's really universal. I think of all of being and time as a form of perpetual choreography, you know? And if you think like that, then you find ways to invite the whole universe into a project. And I mean, I loved what Rayyane was saying about time and will things last. I mean, there's two projects I'll quickly speak and finish. One that's on the slides is this yew tree project. It's made of brass, so it's sonic and sonorous. And we worked with the stakeholders, with the client, and I said, can I make a public artwork that is designed to be overtaken by nature? And it became a wonderful way to bring the community into the dialogue about what a public artwork can mean, and to hand over ownership. And that was for Cambridge University, and we worked with the Sainsbury Centre for Plant Research to design the sculpture and the molds so that it would leave gaps in the roots that would be wide and deep enough for rainwater to collect, to stimulate the growth of moss and lichen to overtake the work. And we worked with the landscape architects to plant around it, so that would encroach on the work. So for me, with that work, I sort of felt like I was extending the idea of the public into the rainwater, into the lichen. So there were people involved, but nature was also my public, or I was nature's public. You know, it's this starting to think how we dance. The other one I'll quickly touch on is the cycles of the moon you might have seen. On a facade of an old restored cinema, and it's relief ceramic, so it's the moon moving through the sky, but it also acts as an accidental sundial. So any time of day you see it, it's a different encounter for the public. So it becomes a way of having movement continually.
Thank you. Next point for us is regional context and shared spaces. Again, one of the major elements that we look at is this idea of public sphere, especially in the region, though there have been almost an erosion of the idea of a public sphere. And all of it, most of it is being scared of the public and uprisings, like with the Tahrir Square. That is a public space and public sphere next to the museum in the middle of, with an artwork right in the middle. But in the region, public space is often negotiated across histories, borders, and rapid urban change. Can a public art create shared civic experiences that transcend political and social divisions? That's it.
Yeah, asking the South Africans question. No, it is very interesting because, as you said that, I was also thinking about many public squares in South Africa, and the removal of the Cecil John Rhodes statue in Cape Town, which was this incredible performance in and of itself when that statue was removed, but also to see how the students engaged with it and marked that historic moment with a performance. And to think about how we renegotiate those histories or how we retell those stories also as, I don't want to use the term artwork, but that is also, it's also a form of creative expression. And it has its own weight in the world, and I think it should have more weight in how it shapes our practices and our works. And I guess maybe this example, also reflecting on what Rayyane and Shezad have been saying about climate, similarly in thinking about your question in relation to how the public is involved, I think, again, I just want to underscore and reiterate this idea that it's not something that is separate. And I think it's also, I believe very much in listening and in works being a platform for others to engage with and be in, and listening as a form of practice. And I understand that that is generous in its intention. But even from a very, very selfish perspective, for my own conceptual food and what makes me feel excited and driven to make works, I'm really interested in learning from processes that come from people, from thinking through how those can shape work and how they can shape worlds. And if we think, for example, both on the question of climate, permanence, and public engagement and involvement, if we think of something like Janneh in Mali, where mud masons remud the mosque each year, that is a project that has been sustained for hundreds of years, but at the same time is being made anew each year. Every year on the eve of the rains, there is a festival for the remudding, and there's a collaboration with the seasons because the mosque is remudded and then the rains fall and complete that process of mudding. And in the festival, everybody has a role to play. Children, the elders pass down the knowledge from generation to generation. It's incredibly festive, the forms of decorum and celebration, the way that people prepare food for each other. That logic, that procession of people, that mass organization and galvanizing around creating a work is something that should be, for me, that is something really interesting in how we think about shaping canon. I am also always thinking about forms of procession, about how we are interacting and engaging and activating works. But how do those logics start to translate into how we make? If we shift the question of permanence in those terms, because of course that work is very, very permanent, but it's not stuck to a permanence that is static. It is thinking about a permanence that is dynamic. It's thinking about legacy, about history, about heritage. And I think that those logics are, of course, much more robust, but also much more interesting. And they have different, not only do they have different solutions, so to speak, to challenges of climate, challenges of isolation, challenges of loneliness that we have as a planet, but they also offer completely different paradigms, ways of being, living, and forms of institutional knowledge.
Thank you. I love everything you guys have been saying, and especially bringing in your experiences and in creating art, in creating architecture, in creating dialogues. So as a closing final, I'd like to ask each of you to share a moment where you felt the public artwork truly created community, and the one assumption about public art that you believe is urgently needed to be undone.
What was the first question? Sorry.
So share a moment where you felt the public artwork truly created community.
Yeah. Okay, I'll answer the second question first. I think besides impermanence, which is, in my opinion, is one of the really misunderstood concept about public art, I think scale is the big misconception. I remember in architecture school, a professor told us, if you can't make it good, make it big. If you can't make it big, make it red. And so I keep hearing that whenever I'm invited to think of public work, because the first impulse is like, can I make the biggest thing possible, right? You know, that's a psychological conversation which we can have at a later time. But I really think if we consider, you know, once again, if we were to challenge scale, precisely because I think that if we were to work from inside out, from within, if we were to kind of really, I think, listen carefully to what Shezad, Sumayya, Sheikha, Reem, and I are, I think, hinting at, is this idea of accumulation. This idea of, you know, you get to a large scale by a series of small gestures that are orchestrated in a way that all of a sudden you find yourself kind of surrounded by something that might look, you know, visually that it's quite large, but it's actually made out of all these pieces, right? Not just mechanically or materially, but also philosophically and conceptually. So I would really like to kind of challenge this notion of scale when it comes to public art. I think that maybe two encounters that have moved me were, one happened actually earlier this week in the work that's here on display in Ben Jassim House. You know, the invitation of Wael came at a very difficult moment in my personal life, and at first I had refused the proposal, and then, you know, when I finally was standing in the middle of this piece, one of the people who were assisting on the production, his name is Subin, told me that back in December, a few weeks ago when I came for my first site visit, he had asked me if I had done this work before. And I thought he was asking me if I had used the material before or this form. And I said, no, I haven't done this work before. And then he came up to me and he said, I asked you this question because I have seen this work before in my dreams. And when I saw the sketch of the work, you know, he was really moved by it because he didn't realize what was going on. And so I started asking questions because back then we were still resolving certain issues with the work. So I was like, what did the floor look like? How was the sculpture lit? Like, help me figure out these decisions because I don't know what's going on. But I was really moved by this moment of encounter because it, you know, solidified my belief that we are really channeling things that precede us, things that will survive us, and that this moment of encounter is essential not only to the making of the work, but also to its longevity, that essentially, you know, these works exist in our imagination. And that is more important, in my opinion, than anything that I can build.
Thank you. You guys have 1:15 each.
I'll be quick. For me, I think it's always about people. I'm deeply nervous and insecure in a good way, I think, because if you're not worried about, you know, what you've done and whether it will, you know, have meaning or touch people, you know. And so for me, like with the playground here, I made so many friends that in Doha, you know, that I'm lucky enough to get WhatsApp messages and emails all the time saying, look at the playground tonight, and it's full of kids. And I'm like, oh my God, it's working. You know, it's taking yourself out of the equation and realizing you're privileged enough to be in a position to realize some crazy ideas that allow poetry, memory, time, play to come into being with others. And when it's, you know, the greatest success is people responding with love, and hopefully with the same love you've put into the work.
Thank you, Sumayya.
I think I had this very surreal moment when I was working on the first Islamic Arts Biennale, where I realized that our audience could be my nephews, and they also visited, or my grandmother. And there were so many, in the beginning, naysayers about the title, the first Islamic Arts Biennale. And I was very, very adamant that I took the project on because of that framing, even though there was so much criticism and so much negativity around why a platform like that should exist and whether it becomes exclusive or by virtue of its title. But for me, and I'm giving this as an example because it has nothing to do with me, that framing specifically is why it was at the time such a highly visited project and why there were 500,000 people in 5 weeks. Because I think that people who otherwise feel uncomfortable in something called a contemporary art museum, or, you know, would not necessarily spend time and visit a space for art, felt like this space was for them, that they had something there that resonated with and that was about their way of life, about our way of life and our way of being. And I saw that and heard that expressed in voice notes from friends who took their parents and grandparents, their kids over and over again, because I think the power and the opportunity for that is that when we have a project that allows people to enter from their perspectives, or from our perspectives, I should say, then, you know, what we present in that platform can be infinite and open, because you're providing a basis and an invitation for people to come in, and then they can also be exposed to contemporary art and to ideas and to conversations and discussions that otherwise they first would have felt is not for them.
Thank you so much. I hope you all get to visit the different public arts that are around the whole country, but also for each of our panelists today. And also to think about the challenge of the public, and that when a public art is being created, there's so many negotiations that are actually happening. And it isn't about just placing an artwork in a location. It's actually the thought that goes behind all of it. Thank you so much. Thank you to my panelists.
I would also like to thank all of our panelists and Sheikha Reem for this most inspiring conversation, for sharing your views on the public, for bringing your work and your ideas to this forum. And I would love to thank you all for being here, and also to invite you to come back at 3:15, when we will have a panel on inventing the rules, curating Rubaiya's inaugural edition. Rubaiya Qatar is a new platform. You will hear all about it if you come at 3:15. Our speakers are Tom Eccles, Ruba Katrib, Mark Rappolt, Shabir Hussein Mustafa, and it's moderated by Tirdad Zolkhadr. Thank you. Thanks.